This is the story of the 2023 Heckfield Bilby Bash. This adventure started at Heckfield and took us from Heckfield to Moree, Moree to Lightning Ridge to Burke, Burke to Hungerford, Hungerford back to Burke, Burke to Goondiwindi, Goondiwindi to Toowoomba, and then back to civilization. We got to Heckfield at 7-something in the morning, with core objective to leave early and be on our way. As they say, if you've got time to spare, go by air, and that was certainly true this day. Having sat down and discussed our options for departure, and whether in fact we were actually going to go, it was decided there were a couple of potential routes for getting to our first stop of Lightning Ridge. Some of us planned to trek direct to Moree, whilst others decided that a direct to Goondiwindi was a better choice. So having fueled the aircraft, done our pre-flights, mandatory checks and run-ups, we were ready to go with an early departure time no later than midday. We set our track to the southwest, departed Heckfield with the intention of tracking over Lake Maroon and then turning right to Goondiwindi. I'd decided that I had about 15 hours of flight time over the coming days to teach my partner Lindsay something about navigation. So on the way to Lake Maroon, we had a lesson on the WAC and how to mark track miles using a calibrated pencil. It's probably worth discussing the weather. It would be fair to say that the weather was ordinary at best. We had a front coming in from the west that was expected to be over us in 5 days' time. It was reasonably high wind, overcast, very overcast, and quite chilly. We turned about 5 miles past Lake Maroon towards Goondiwindi, and as the cloud base below us thickened, we decided that perhaps Goondiwindi wasn't such a good idea after all. We backtracked a few minutes, descended under the cloud, and diverted to Moree. It turns out that Lindsay had failed to follow the first rule of flying, which is don't drink coffee before you leave. After a brief stop between Lake Maroon and Moree, we had an uneventful landing, pulled up at the fuel bowser, where we met 2 of our colleagues, Mark and John. The outside air temperature at Moree was 6 degrees, it was blowing a gale, and it was extremely chilly. We refueled, John got a new battery, and I put on a jacket. We departed and set track for our next stop, Lightning Ridge. As we were tracking from Moree to Lightning Ridge and discussing the benefits and drawbacks of ADSB and realising that Oz runways will only work if you've got a Telstra SIM, we started to wonder about the whereabouts of Rowan, who at the time was tracking from Goondiwindi to Lightning Ridge. We're comforted when we heard seaplane, this is Brisbane Centre, can we be of assistance? At that point we knew Rowan was in safe hands and we continued on our journey. Turns out that Rowan was able to get the weather from another aircraft that had recently departed Lightning Ridge. We each landed in turn and began packing up and securing the aircraft. We noted the lack of a fuel bowser that dispensed avgas, proceeded through the terminal and waited to be collected and taken to our accommodation. Sometime later, a wonderful woman Sue rocked up. We piled into her vehicle and she dropped us to our various accommodations around Lightning Ridge. We had dinner, settled in for the night and woke up the next morning. I prepared Lindsay a mocha and we headed down for breakfast. Over breakfast we discussed the challenges with John's aircraft and what we were going to do to fix it. Then we called Sue, who gladly lent us her vehicle so we could visit the Chamber of the Black Hand. The Chambers of the Black Hand was created by a local opal miner and artist Ron Canlon. His love of opal drew him to Lightning Ridge in 1982 in hope of finding his fortunes. Unfortunately, Ron's mine didn't produce much opal, and he began carving in the stone using a butter knife. After some years of carving, and many sculptures later, he decided to open his mine to the public. On entering the mine, you descend a series of 83 steps before the mine opens into an array of caverns and tunnels, the walls of which are covered in extraordinary artworks, all carved by Ron with the same butter knife. After our visit to the chambers of Black Hand, it was time to go back to the field, refuel, and depart. But before we could, there were some running repairs that needed to be done.
No, I just found the problem. Yep.
Oh, look, the plane fits like a glove.
So, with that challenge out of the road and a disaster averted, it was getting late and it was time for full power so we could get to our next destination, Burke. The flight to Burke was uneventful. On landing, we parked our aircraft, packed them up for the night, and proceeded to catch the courtesy bus to our accommodation. It had been a long day, so having checked into our accommodation, we went out the back of Burke to the Northern Hotel, the Northie, for dinner. In the morning, we had breakfast, went for a walk around Burke and went to the only J car that sells ride-on lawnmowers, and returned to the field for the final leg to Hungerford. Having finally made it to our destination, we parked the planes, sent the drone up to get some footage, and then proceeded back into town to have something to eat. Hungerford has a population that you can count on one hand. We had dinner at Hungerford's Royal Mail Hotel. The Royal Mail Hotel is a fantastic example of a way out back pub. The venue is full of local memorabilia and of interest for that alone. We had dinner. We were lucky enough on this particular evening to be invited to a party which had 20 people in it. You can't count 20 people on one hand. Where they came from, I'm not entirely sure, but nevertheless, fun was had by all. When we awoke the next morning, we were faced with a dilemma. Our original plan was to take us to Roma and then back to Heckfield. But this front coming in from the west was gaining speed, and there was real concern that if we went to Roma, we'd get stuck there. Having consulted every piece of reference material the internet would give us, we decided instead to head back to southeast Queensland that day. It was going to be a long trip. After some discussion, it was decided the best place for us to stay the night was Toowoomba, being at the top of the mountain, and we anticipated being able to find accommodation that had a few more stars than the accommodation that stayed in at Hungerford. We refueled, did our pre-flight, and then headed back for the long trip home. The trip home took us back to Burke, and then from Burke through to Goondiwindi, and from Goondiwindi to Toowoomba. We arrived in Toowoomba late in the afternoon. Being the great forward planners we are, we landed in Toowoomba with no accommodation, so we jumped on Expedia in order to find a place to stay. After discarding a couple of options that were probably no better than the accommodation in Hungerford, we settled on a quaint little place called the Burke and Wills Hotel. Following a hearty meal and a nap, we got up the next morning to head back home. We awoke the next morning to discover some typical Toowoomba weather. Wall-to-wall cloud, chilly, and the wind blowing from the east. Those of our party who could access controlled airspace had arranged to overfly Amberley direct to Heckfield. That left Lindsay and I to pick our way through the restricted areas on the way back.